Year of Dionysius Cave Prison. In 413 BC, the ancient Greek city of Syracuse on the island of Sicily won a terrible war. Athens had sent a massive army across the sea to conquer Syracuse, but the attack failed. The Syracusan army crushed the invaders and captured around 7,000 Athenian soldiers alive. The people of Syracuse needed a place to lock up all these prisoners. They chose the caves. Beneath the hills of Syracuse, there were huge caves carved out of the limestone rock. These caves were old stone quarries dug out over many years to build the city's temples and walls. The biggest of these caves was a giant hollow carved deep into the cliff face. It was 23 meters high, 65 meters deep, and shaped like a giant teardrop. The prisoners were thrown into these caves by the thousands. There was no food waiting for them. There was no clean water. There was almost no light. The ancient historian Thucydides wrote about what happened to those men inside the caves. They were packed together so tightly that they could barely move. The sun burned down through the open top during the day. At night, the cold autumn air froze them where they lay. The dead were piled up alongside the living. Disease spread fast in the filth and the darkness. Many of the 7,000 prisoners died inside those caves within weeks. Over 100 years later, a tyrant named Dionysius I took control of Syracuse. He ruled with cruelty and fear. Dionysius turned the great cave into his own personal prison. He locked up political enemies, poets, and anyone who spoke against him. But Dionysius had a secret. The shape of the cave acted like a giant ear. Any sound made inside was amplified and carried upward through the narrow top of the cave. Even a whisper at the bottom could be heard clearly at the top. Dionysius used this to spy on his prisoners. He would sit at a hidden point above the cave and listen to every word they said. He heard their plans, their secrets, and their complaints. Anyone caught plotting against him was tortured or killed. Centuries later, the famous Italian painter Caravaggio visited the cave in 1608. He noticed the shape looked exactly like a human ear. He named it the Ear of Dionysius, and the name stuck forever. The cave still stands today in the Neapolis Archaeological Park of Syracuse. Tourists can walk inside and clap their hands to hear the echo bounce off the ancient walls. But 2,000 years ago, those walls heard only screams. Mangapwani slave caves, hidden prison, on the coast of Zanzibar, hidden behind thick tropical forest and crumbling coral cliffs. There are two caves that hold one of the darkest secrets of the East African slave trade. The caves are called Mangapwani, and for decades they were used as secret underground prisons, where captured men, women, and children were held before being shipped across the Indian Ocean. The first cave is a natural formation, a large coral cavern carved by nature into the coastal rock over thousands of years. For centuries, it had been nothing more than a shelter used by local fishermen. But during the height of the East African slave trade in the 1800s, the cave was turned into a holding pit for enslaved people. Traders would march captives from the interior of Africa to the coast in chains, sometimes walking for weeks through the bush. When they reached Mangapwani, the captives were forced down into the dark coral cave and held there, shackled together for days or even weeks. The cave was damp, airless, and pitch black. The only light came from the narrow opening at the surface. Dozens of people were crammed into the small space with no food, no clean water, and no room to lie down. When the slave ships arrived under cover of darkness, the captives were dragged from the cave to the shoreline and loaded onto boats. Many of them never saw their homeland again. Then, in 1873, the Sultan of Zanzibar officially banned the slave trade under heavy pressure from the British government. But the ban did not stop the trafficking. It only drove it underground. A short walk from the natural cave, slave traders carved a second chamber directly into the rock. This man-made cave was narrow, rectangular, and completely windowless, designed specifically to hide enslaved people from British naval patrols. It was a purpose-built secret prison, invisible from the surface and impossible to find unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside, captives were held in total darkness, while traders waited for the right moment to move them to the coast. The artificial cave was so well hidden that British authorities struggled to locate it for years, even though they knew illegal trafficking was still happening on the island. The slave trade through Zanzibar was massive. An estimated 50,000 enslaved people passed through the island's markets every single year at its peak. Newgate Mine Underground Prison. On a cold day in 1773, the colony of Connecticut made a decision that would create one of the most terrifying prisons in American history. They took an abandoned copper mine buried deep inside a mountain in the town of Simsbury and turned it into the country's first official state prison. The mine had been dug into the rock beginning in 1707, creating a labyrinth of caves, tunnels, and vertical shafts plunging 70 feet below the surface. When the copper ran out, the government saw something else in those dark tunnels, like a place no prisoner could ever escape from. They named it Newgate Prison. The first prisoner arrived in 1773, then a burglar named John Hinson, who was sentenced to hard labor deep inside the mountain. To enter the prison, inmates were forced to climb down a narrow ladder through a 25-foot vertical shaft into total darkness. At the bottom, the tunnel stretched out in every direction, cold, wet, and pitch black. Wooden platforms were built along the cave walls where prisoners slept on beds of rotting straw. There was no sunlight, no fresh air, and the temperature underground stayed near freezing year-round. The walls dripped with moisture, and pools of standing water sat in the lowest sections of the tunnels. Every morning at 4 o'clock, guards hauled the prisoners up from the caves in chains and forced them to work in a nail factory until late afternoon. Then they were sent back down into the darkness for the night. When the American Revolution broke out, Newgate took on an even darker purpose. The prison began holding loyalists, alongside convicted thieves and murderers. These political prisoners were treated no differently than the worst criminals. They were whipped for disobedience, starved on half-edible food, and shackled in the freezing caves for months at a time. Some historians believe the brutal treatment of loyalists at Newgate was one of the reasons the British treated American prisoners so harshly aboard their infamous prison ships in New York. Despite being called escape-proof, prisoners tried to break out again and again. In 1776, a group of inmates smuggled hay into the tunnels and tried to burn down the wooden door that sealed the exit shaft. But the damp underground air turned the fire into a smolder, and the smoke killed one prisoner before the plan failed. In 1781, prisoners armed with rocks and scraps of metal rushed the shaft entrance and overwhelmed 2 guards during a gate change. Several men made it to the surface and escaped into the surrounding forest. After each escape attempt, the guards tightened security, adding stone walls, armed soldiers, and eventually a 12-foot perimeter wall around the entire site. But the conditions underground never improved. Prisoners continued to suffer from disease, frostbite, and madness, brought on by months of living in total darkness beneath the earth. Buda Castle Labyrinth, cave prison. Beneath the streets of Budapest, Hungary, there is a maze of caves that most people never see. These caves sit 16 meters under the Buda Castle district, one of the oldest parts of the city. They stretch for over 1,200 meters through the rock beneath the castle walls. The caves were not built by humans. They were carved naturally by hot thermal waters that flowed through the limestone over hundreds of thousands of years. Prehistoric humans used these caves as shelters over 350,000 years ago. Stone tools from that era were found deep inside the tunnels. Over the centuries, the caves were used for many things: wine cellars, storage rooms, and hiding places during wars. But the caves also held a much darker purpose. They were used as a prison, and their most famous prisoner was one of the most feared men in history. His name was Vlad Tepes. The world knows him better as Vlad the Impaler, the real-life inspiration for Count Dracula. In the 1400s, Vlad was the ruler of Wallachia, a region that is now part of Romania. His job was to protect Christian Europe from the invading Ottoman Turks. He was an ally of King Matthias of Hungary. But Vlad made secret deals with the Turks behind the king's back. When King Matthias found out, he was furious. Around 1462, the king had Vlad captured and dragged to Budapest. Vlad was thrown into the deepest, darkest chamber beneath the castle. The cave was cold, damp, and pitch black. Water dripped from the ceiling. The walls were slimy with mold. There was no sunlight, no warmth, and no way out. Nobody knows exactly how long Vlad was kept in those caves. Some historians say he was locked underground for over 10 years. Others say it was shorter. What is known is that when Vlad was finally released, he was a changed man. After his years in the dark, he became infamous for his extreme cruelty. He earned the name the Impaler because he tortured and killed thousands of people by driving wooden stakes through their bodies. Many believe that the years of darkness and suffering inside the caves drove him to madness. The cave that held Vlad still exists today. Tourists can walk through the tunnels and visit a chamber marked as Dracula's cell. A coffin glows in blue light at the end of the passage. Some legends say Vlad was buried inside the labyrinth after his death. In the 1800s, people reported seeing a ghost called the Black Count wandering the tunnels at night. During World War II, the caves were used as a bomb shelter and a military hospital. Then in 2011, something strange happened. Armed police suddenly raided the labyrinth without warning. They evacuated everyone inside and locked the doors. No official reason was ever given for the raid. The caves were eventually reopened, but with a new operator and heavy restrictions. Nobody knows what the police found down there. The Buda Castle Labyrinth has kept secrets for 500,000 years.